Hello gamers, Power Hill here, and welcome to the Classic Plus Corner. This is a segment of the channel where we discuss all things related to WoW Classic Plus. This will be episode 14, and today we'll be talking about Arena in Classic Plus. Should you have it or not? And this was more of a divisive issue than I had originally anticipated. When I had originally seen Arena on the surveys and things of that nature, I was just thinking, okay, the response to this is going to be pretty overwhelmingly positive. And, for the most part, I think it was still relatively positive, but there was more pushback than I expected. I expected almost kind of no pushback. And I saw a bunch of pushback like on Reddit and things of that nature, and it kind of caught me by surprise. Because, if you would have asked me like a year or so ago if I should, if I was making Classic Plus, would I include Arena? I probably would have been like, yeah, undoubtedly, like there's no reason why not to, right? And I think this mostly stems from the fact that, typically speaking, I think it's good to have, players have a choice of what they want to do in the game. And, I don't want to really take things away from players, right? A lot of people like to do Arena in various forms of World of Warcraft. So it kind of is a no-brainer to add to Classic Plus, right? And then beyond that, they did add it in the Burning Crusade, which is very Classic adjacent, right? So you could kind of make the argument that, well, maybe in the original vanilla, they just didn't have the, the resources really to commit to making a proper arena, because it takes a little bit, right? They have to make the actual arenas, then they have to make the ranking system, things of that nature. A lot of times they want to add a reward system in, which we'll talk about later. I don't think that's a good idea, but you kind of get the point. So I was thinking, maybe it's just like a thing that they wanted to do but couldn't do. But the thing you have to be careful about when kind of thinking in that way is that it's a bit fallacious, right? Because keep in mind that there's a reason why we are starting the break for Classic Plus at actual like Classic era and not TBC, and that has to do, for some reasons, to do with the game design decisions that were made for TBC that aren't available in Classic era. So at some point, something kind of broke down and the game started to veer off more into the retail direction. Now, a lot of people are going to argue this is more towards Wrath, but I think it actually did start in the Burning Crusade as well. It just wasn't quite as noticeable. And it can be very tempting, when you're kind of looking at this, just like an ad hoc analysis, to kind of be like, okay, well, this was pretty Classic adjacent, so clearly it's fine if we just shove it into Classic Plus, right? But I don't really think that logic holds up, like I said, because, we can notice the differences. Like, we don't want the Burning Crusade Plus, we want Classic Plus, right? And while I don't think that Arena is necessarily the issue that everybody, thinks about when they think about how the Burning Crusade maybe started the path towards retail, I think it's difficult to know sometimes, and it's worth investigating and thinking about it, right? I think typically when people think of things that kind of start us on the path to retail from TBC, they think of things like the gear homogenization, flying. Those are more of like the negative things. But still, there might be other systems that on the surface we think are kind of good, that maybe we don't actually want in Classic Plus. I think a lot of those tend to be convenience related, not necessarily like, PvP mode related. But still, it's worth kind of going back to first principles and investigating this, I thought. So that's what we're going to be doing in this video. And when I thought about it a bit more, I kind of came up with a couple ideas for why Classic or Arena might not work so well in Classic Plus. But I also thought of a solution. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to present the couple ideas as to why I think, Arena might be a little bit weird in a Classic environment. And then I'll talk about something we can do to maybe kind of smooth over that and help integrate it into the game so that it feels good. Because ultimately, I would like to see Arena in the game, I think, as long as it doesn't really harm the feel of the game, right? Like if we can get another game mode that people like in the game without sort of, I guess you could say compromising the integrity of Classic, then why not, right? So I'll kind of give you my thoughts, and we'll start with the negatives, right? So the first thing that comes to mind immediately is that Arena is harder to balance than RBGs. And I would say this is for a couple of reasons. If you noticed in the RBG video, this was also a concern for Blizzard, even with RBGs, right? So they didn't want to do RBGs in Season of Discovery because the class balance was so out of whack. Now, we're not going to have the Season of Discovery class balance problem to the same degree that we did in Season of Discovery, but we are going to get kind of new abilities, so this does already present another challenge for them, right? So right off the bat, there's another challenge there. And then with Arena being a smaller player sizes, the impact of individual player, or in this case, individual classes, is just a lot higher. And you can actually see this because I'm not a current follower of retail Arena PvP. However, I know that at certain points in the game, the 2v2 bracket was basically made, I think, ineligible for rewards. So the idea was, most, I don't know how it is currently in retail, but throughout most of retail's life, you needed certain rating requirements to get pieces of gear and things of that nature. And for a while, like after TBC and onwards, you could get those rating requirements from the 2v2 mode of Arena. But at some point, they changed it so that you had to do 3v3 or something else. Like 5v5, I think, potentially. Like, I don't know if it was only 3v3, but you basically, you were ineligible getting them from 2v2, was the thought process. I think eventually they just removed 5v5, right? I'm not entirely sure, but, and I think the reason why this happened was because 2v2 was just really, really hard to balance. You'd kind of end up with these comps that were just hyper dominant, and, it was way easier to get rewards as some comps and almost impossible to get rewards as other comps. So I think Blizzard was just like, okay, we don't want really people to cheese the system, if they belong to one of these comps that's really easy to abuse in 2v2 because it's just so strong. So we're going to change the system. And the reason for that is because 2v2 just allows you to control a lot of variables. When it's just 2-on-2 classes, like kits countering each other, it is much bigger of a deal. Think of like a 5v5 game like League of Legends, okay? And think if you just reduced League of Legends with all the champions they have in the game, right, to a 1v1 game mode. So it was like, you were in 1v1 ARAM, you spawned to the map, you picked a champion, and you just fought another champion. Think of how terrible that would be to play, right? Because of all the absolute, crazy counter imbalances, right? You can just play a character that basically it's unplayable against any other character, or not any other character, but a bunch of other characters on the roster, and all of a sudden, it just becomes like a super boring experience, right? You either dominate or you get shredded. Of course, you're going to have some skill matchups thrown in there, but a lot of the matchups are going to be very one-sided. So when you have the game kind of sprawl out into 5v5, and then you have the lanes and things of that nature, so you have objectives, it creates a lot more space for other strategies and certain champions to work in a way where they wouldn't in a straight-up 1v1 fight. So that there's kind of two things going on there. There's the actual fighting as a team is different than fighting solo, right? Which makes certain class combinations a bit more viable. And then in Battlegrounds, because the objective isn't simply to slay your enemy, and there's actually kind of an objective and maybe multiple ways to play around the objective or, facilitate getting an objective in cases like Warsong Gulch and things of that nature, that means that, more classes have a role to play here. And, metas are going to develop regardless, right? So there's going to be a meta RBG comp. But my point is that the meta RBG comp should be at least a bit more flexible than the meta arena comp. Now, the only way that this kind of doesn't work is if the conditions of the battleground are like hyper specific. So, for example, in something like Warsong Gulch, there are elements to a meta that might be very static. So something like a druid running your flag, right, in a various version of the game where that's strong. If that happens to be really strong in Classic Plus still, then we are still going to see, a lot of Druid flag runs and things of that nature. But still, there has to be a supporting cast around that player, and there's still much more flexibility within that than within like a 2v2 arena comp, right? So I think class balance is one of the bigger issues in the sense that they're probably going to expect class balance to be a little bit worse than even in normal Classic WoW, because we're adding new things to Classic, right? And we're not necessarily trying to homogenize in the same way that we were going into the Burning Crusade, right? So what they're trying to do is they're trying to really keep class identity from Classic, not kind of necessarily super balance things, which could make things really awkward and real. Like, let's say, for example, they don't change things like sap and poly, okay? Imagine like those really long saps and polys in Arena. Now, most likely we probably will get some type of adjustment to sap and poly. So I'm not trying to say that we won't, but it's just kind of a like an example to think about, right? Where if they don't nerf it enough, or maybe they don't touch it at all, then suddenly, Arena becomes really awkward in this environment. Because if you thought like Rogue Mage was oppressive in some seasons in TBC and 2v2, then it would be really oppressive in a vanilla version of the game. Like Rogue Mage would just be an insanely strong combination. Now, obviously, we're going to get other abilities and things like that, so things could change, but you get the general sentiment of what I'm trying to say. And these things were already a problem in the sort of like TBC and then going on to retail version of the game where they were trying to homogenize. So when they're not trying to homogenize, you could just imagine they'll probably be like at least a couple times worse. So that's the first thing, is the balancing. And then the other thing is a bit more subtle, which is that I think it's just easier to get into Arena in a sense than into rated battlegrounds. Obviously, normal battlegrounds are super kind of easy. You just queue up, you get in, and you play, right? But for a rated battleground, if you have a requirement of like 10 or 15 people, that's a lot more to ask of a player than, just finding a buddy to 2v2 with or finding two buddies to 3v3 with. So the accessibility of Arena, I think actually is really what contributed to making it the more dominant sort of PvP. How would you say? Like it's the most dominant sort of form of PvP when you compare it to RBGs and Arena. Like they don't really have like a equivalent of the Arena Championships for RBGs, as far as I know. It's the Arena Championships, and I think the reason for that is just because Arena is so much more accessible. More people tended to play it and things of that nature. So, and also this has to do with the reward system a little bit, right? Because not only was it more accessible just at base, but when you have a reward system put into the game, so things like conquest points, you're getting PvP gear from doing things like Arena or RBGs, people are going to try and interact with the reward system in the way that it's easiest for them to do that. And most of the time, it's just going to be easier for them to make a 2v2 or a 3v3 Arena team than it is going to be for them to try and assemble an RBG team, right? That's kind of just the facts. 10 players, a lot harder to come by than 3 players, and then you don't really know what you're getting, right? You can control the variables a lot more if you just need one other partner. You can be hyper selective. If you need 2 other partners, you can still be pretty selective. If you need 9 other partners, now you're really at the mercy, and you really have to do kind of a lot more networking. You have to really be willing to kind of put in a lot of time to just play with multiple people, and then you really have to see who's good and who's not. And another problem with these battlegrounds is that when you're doing an RBG, you're not necessarily playing directly with everybody in that RBG. So how do you know that like the mage that you have at stables or the hunter or whatever is actually legit or not? You kind of have to take his word for it, take the word for it of the people that are playing more adjacent to him. Maybe if we keep losing stable all the time, maybe that's a good that's a good indicator that he's not good, right? But it's much more harder to find positive indicators potentially that he's good. If things seem to be going relatively okay, and maybe he's just not getting a lot of pressure there, right? Or maybe he's good at spinning in a certain case, but not in other cases, and you don't really have a way to analyze that because maybe you're fighting in a different portion of the map. So it can be really difficult to, just kind of find players, first of all, that you want to play with, and then evaluate them when you're doing something like a 10v10 battleground. And my concern with all this is basically that if you add RBGs to the game, if you add Arena to the game and you have RBGs at the same time, will it dilute the pool, not only for both of them, but I'm really more concerned about RBGs, right? The classic community has been wanting RBGs forever, and then you'll suddenly add RBGs into the game, but you'll add Arena on top of that, and all of a sudden people are just going to be only doing Arena potentially, right? Because it's just that much easier to find a partner and things of that nature. Just that much easier to kind of get into, right? So that's a potential concern, I think, especially because the audience for PvP in the game, I wouldn't say it's small, and I actually do think it might be larger than kind of other gaming contingents. So if you kind of broke down the player base of like other MMOs, people that play WoW, especially classic WoW, maybe a higher percentage of them are into PvP than the other game modes, than in the other MMOs. But even then, it's not like a huge percentage of the player base, and you have to be careful because you already have like 3 battlegrounds. We're probably gonna get another one, so we're gonna have 4 battlegrounds. Depending on what 4th battleground we get, that may not even be eligible for RBGs because you're probably not going to have AV be eligible, right? So if we get another big battleground, which I hope we don't, but we might, that probably won't be RBG eligible. So then you'll have 4 battlegrounds, then you'll have RBGs, which kind of take up 2 battlegrounds, and then you'll have arenas, and then you still have open world PvP going on because there'll probably be more of that in a version like Classic Plus than there's ever been in a version like a version of the game like Retail or something like that. So there's a bunch of these different avenues for PvP, and it's very possible that RBGs really fall by the wayside. So if that's the concern, what can we do to maybe sort of prevent that, right? And I think the best thing that we can do to prevent that is to just not have a reward system. We already talked about this in the RBG video, but it's worth repeating in case you're just an arena player and you've only clicked on this video, you don't really care about the RBG video. But I think having a reward system is just not great for Arena, and the same reasons apply that I had for RBGs, which are basically that I don't like the loot stratification that kind of happens where good players that are already better than the player base get access to even better gear that allows them to sort of stomp harder. I made the case in the other video that I've played in a system like this in Destiny 2, where at one point they added a weapon that was like the best in the game from getting the highest rank in PvP. I got the highest rank in PvP in that game, and it just kind of felt boring because you're already better than pretty much everybody you're fighting, and now you have an even more powerful weapon, so you're just going to gap them even harder. And at that point, it kind of removes a bunch of the challenge from things. So I don't really like that. I think it's frustrating for the players on the lower end. I think it creates boring gameplay for the players on the top end. I think it also creates like just more annoying drama of excuses being made of like, oh, I can't get high ranking because, I don't have access to the gear because I'm not there if somebody starts later in the season, right? And, although I do think a lot of times player skill matters much more than gear, there can be certain nuggets of truth to that, right? If somebody's like really outgeared in PvP, if the skill is similar, they're probably going to lose. So, I think it kind of quells those arguments as well. And I think in this particular case, if you remove rewards from both Arena and RBGs, and you just have them kind of in a normal PvP honor system, what that does is it allows players to end up just playing what they want. So instead of trying to find the most efficient way to get conquest points or the most efficient way to get their rank high enough to be able to get the specific gear they need with those conquest points, they're more concerned about just playing what's fun for them, right? It makes sense, like if you have to hit, like let's say 2K or 2200 to get a weapon or a shoulder reward, right? You might think to yourself, well, I could just kind of keep playing RBGs with random people, and I have to eventually put together a 10-man, and getting all these people online is going to be really annoying. And then what if one of these people quits the game? I have to find a replacement for him, and it's going to take me a ton of time to put this group together. Why would they bother trying to get that gear and rating RBG when they could just find one other partner for a 2v2 or 2 other partners for a 3v3, and they can invest in people who they know are going to stick around, and they know it'll be a better investment because it's also going to be a more solid comp, right? They can actually go out of their way to build a comp that advantages them. So really, there's just no... If you're a person who's just trying to get the gear, which there are a lot of people in the game that do just chase items and purples, right? What's the incentive for them to go into an RBG at all, right? Because it's just much more time efficient for them to invest their resources, time, everything like that, in building a viable arena comp in order to, help get them the rating and rank that they need, as well as the conquest points or whatever. So yeah, I think removing the reward system and just having it be a thing about personal pride, and you could have, obviously, like I said in the last video, you could have cosmetic rewards. That's fine. Rank 1 titles. I think all that stuff is great. But yeah, I think you should really separate getting actual in-game items that are like usable in the traditional sense from doing ranked arena or ranked battlegrounds, and they should purely be for ego, for skill showing, and things of that nature. And also, I think that this kind of helps reduce player frustration and toxicity. I didn't really talk about this much in the last video, but this is something I noticed sort of in League of Legends that never made sense to me, is that they had the normal games and they had ranked games. And in League of Legends, the skins are something that people are very sought after. So cosmetics, I feel like, aren't necessarily as big of a deal in World of Warcraft. So this is why I'm more okay with them having, titles and cosmetic rewards for a rank system. But in League, basically what they did is they added some of these cosmetic skins. So it wasn't just like you got a title that said you were good, right? I think that is relatively straightforward and makes a lot of sense. But they actually added these really cool art skins sometimes for hitting certain ranks in the game earlier on. And that never made sense to me, because it was like, okay, so the idea is you want to keep casual players sort of away from competitive players, right? Because you don't want there to be friction with those two interacting, right? You don't want kind of like a casual player going into a ranked game and, they don't really care about what's going on in the game. They're just trying to get a skin, right? So they have some incentive to win, but maybe they don't have the most incentive to win like a player that's trying to climb the ladder does. And, that creates like toxicity and arguments between players, right? Really weird picks happen in ranked if you bring these players in and things of that nature. So it never made sense to me that you would kind of put a reward for the casual player to chase that is actually inside of ranked, right? Because of how big a deal skins are. Like some people, they just really want to have that cool skin on their champion. If they see it, they're like, hey, I'm going to do ranked no matter what, I don't care if I'm, normally I'm just a normal game player, but hey, I want to get that skin. Just completely counterintuitive. And in WoW, I think the equivalent to that is adding gear that's useful in the game into the PvP systems, right? The moment you do that, now people, they're going to rush in. It's kind of like in TBC, right? When this version of the TBC anniversary comes around, there's going to be a ton of players that are just playing Arena, like literally to get the Glad weapon or whatever, or not the Glad, it's like 1850 or 1700 now or something like that. Now, like, to their credit at Blizzard, they did make this easier to get, right? So you're not going to have quite as many people that are mashing their head into the wall, metaphorically, just over and over and over again to try and get this weapon. But still, there's going to be a ton of people that are just doing Arena for PvP, and it's not as big of a deal in a game like this because you tend to make your own teams, right? So there's not going to be as much toxicity between the players. You can kind of choose who you're playing with, but it can still be frustrating for that player base because they feel like they have to participate now to get that 1700 weapon or 1800 weapon, whatever it is, and maybe they just don't really want to do any PvP at all, and they feel like they have to, right? And they have to be good at it is the problem. It's a lot easier to stomach and swallow something like participating in a bit of PvP if you're inevitably going to get the reward anyway, and you don't have to be, you're not under the microscope as much, right? Kind of like with the current honor system, you just have to play, and inevitably you will get it. So I think that if you're going to do that, if you're going to add arenas, if you're going to add RBGs, just remove the reward system, and that'll help solve a lot of these problems. And the people who want to run RBGs will run RBGs. The people who want to run arenas will want to do arenas. You'll get the requisite titles, mounts, whatever from both of these, and everybody should be happy. There might be one that's kind of more or less popular, but ultimately, I think it'll still be okay. And I think the only way things can really go sideways is if you really try and add those reward systems in. And so just keep the normal ranking how it is. Well, we had made a separate video about that. Change it a little bit for sure because there are some problems with it. But keep that gear acquisition in PvP away from the ranked modes, and everything should be all set. So do I think we can have arenas? I think we can. I think it'll be fine. Just don't make them purely cosmetic. Don't give gear, and we should be all set. If you like this, like, comment, subscribe. I will talk to you guys later. See ya.